welcome you here this afternoon. I'm going to say a little bit more in a minute, but before I do so, I want to introduce the Ethiopian ambassador to the UK and the Nordic countries, His Excellency Bahanu Kabedi. Ambassador.
My Lord, Excellencies, honorable parliamentarians, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I welcome you all to this solemn occasion. May I call upon you to observe a minute of silence in memory of our departed leader, the late Prime Minister Meles Zenawi. Thank you. Excellencies, honorable parliamentarians, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, Africa and his motherland, Ethiopia, have lost a true son in the late Prime Minister Meles Zenawi, a distinguished leader, a fighter, a martyr, who dedicated his life to the cause of the people of Ethiopia and Africa. His untimely demise was a tragedy that befell the Ethiopian people and fellow Africans at a time of heightened enthusiasm for African Renaissance, for which he displayed unswerving dedication. Meles was among those at the forefront in fighting oppression, inequality, and injustice since the days of the armed struggle. His commitment to seeing a new future for all Ethiopians set the path for sustainable development, which unlocks the potential of citizens in their pursuit of transforming their lives and preparing for a better and brighter future for the next generation. The wise leadership of Prime Minister Meles and his party produced a constitutional order that guarantees the quality of all the nations, nationalities, and peoples of Ethiopia. Meles implemented an economic strategy that rejuvenated the economy, which had previously been completely destroyed. The policy brought about by Meles and his party was a complete paradigm shift. It was a policy and a strategy which were homegrown and were hugely instrumental in addressing squarely the backwardness, civil strife, and poverty that had brought the nation to the brink of collapse. Prime Minister Meles was a pioneer of the Poverty Alleviation Program and the current 5-year Growth and Transformation Plan, which seeks to overhaul all the economic sectors with the objective of ensuring the fastest possible economic growth, which has stood at 11% on average over the past 9 years. His aim was to achieve prosperity, where people can exercise their rights as equals and as owners of a viable nation. Ethiopia, under the stewardship of Prime Minister Meles, has been a bulwark for peace and stability in the sub-region and beyond, both as member of African Union and of the regional grouping, IGAD. In principle, as well as in deeds, Meles proved how peace is indispensable for development, the linchpin in the fight against the social evils that continue to harm the global world and especially the African continent. It is in this recognition of his outstanding leadership that the people of Ethiopia recently launched the Meles Foundation to allow scholarly studies into his life and works, which inspired the reawakening and renaissance of Ethiopia. The foundation is dedicated to preserving and advancing the legacy of Prime Minister Meles' lifelong commitment to peace, justice, economic development, good governance, and democracy for the Ethiopian and African people. It will provide a living memorial to his selfless struggle, to his statesmanship, and to his perpetual support for freedom and equality of the people of Ethiopia, a place for the study of a new life that Meles Zenawi breathed into Africa's aspiration for peace, democracy, and development. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, Ethiopia's following smooth, peaceful transition of leadership is now focused on the implementation of the Growth and Transformation Plan to sustain the country's fastest growth trajectory. We, the people of Ethiopia, are determined as part of the national drive to see through the legacies of our great leader, who laid the foundation for constitutional federal democratic order, an order which is at the center of the new Ethiopia, the rainbow nation where unity in diversity is cherished and celebrated. We, the people of Ethiopia, inspired by the vision and legacies of Meles, have expressed our commitment to give full support to Ethiopia's Renaissance and work hard for the realization of the Renaissance Dam and other mega projects currently underway. The construction of the Renaissance Dam, road and railway networks across the nation, hospitals, universities, and other infrastructure will remain high on our agenda. Poverty will remain Ethiopia's formidable enemy until such time that prosperity becomes the order of the day. Through the dedication of his priorities and full appreciation of his legacy, we, the people of Ethiopia, will keep Meles alive among us. Excellencies, distinguished guests, allow me to express my gratitude on behalf of the people and government of Ethiopia for your time and interest in reflecting on and celebrating the life and legacy of the great leader, Prime Minister Meles Zenawi. May he rest in peace. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. You can probably see this tie even from the back of the room as it's rather bright. And I'm wearing it for two reasons, really. One is because when the Ambassador asked if I would act as Master of Ceremonies at this occasion, I said, yes, but let's make this a joyous, celebratory sort of occasion. Let's not make it too somber. Let's celebrate what Prime Minister Meles did for Ethiopia. The second reason is that this tie is actually a copy of a stained glass window in the Organisation of African Unity in Addis Ababa, created 50 years ago. This is the year of the 50th anniversary celebrations of the OAU and African Union, created by a very well-known Ethiopian artist, Afewerk Tekle, who also died last year. And the vision, of course, in the early 60s was of African renaissance, of Africa moving forward, of Africa taking its rightful place on the world stage. For various reasons, which I guess may be reflected in some of the comments that will be made by people shortly, that process was delayed for over a quarter of a century. It didn't happen or start to happen until the early 1990s, and the person who we're respecting and celebrating today had a great deal to do with that. We have a wonderful group of participant speakers today, extremely high-level people, many of whom I've worked with extremely closely and for whom I have the greatest respect. But even looking out in the audience, I see former ministers, parliamentarians, existing ministers, people from the decision makers who are helping to make our development policies, our foreign policy, all those policies, come to pay their respects to what we all acknowledge, someone we all acknowledge to be a great leader. It's with great pleasure that I'd like to call on our former Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Gordon Brown, to make the first remarks.
Our life is best measured, not in days, but in deeds. And as we mourn the death of a great Prime Minister, a leader, a colleague, and a friend, whose life was cruelly cut short by a tragic illness in his 57th year, we remember that no leader in the modern history of Ethiopia did more to take people out of poverty, out of illiteracy, from disease, from squalor, from want, than Prime Minister Meles. No one did more to eradicate the evils that arise from poverty than he did. And no one achieved more in these 2 short decades in which he was power in the history of the continent of Africa at that time than Prime Minister Meles. It is also the case that Sophocles, the great Greek writer, said, you've got to wait until the evening before you can see how splendid the day was. And today we've already recorded some of the great achievements of Prime Minister Meles. The creation of the modern Eritrea and Ethiopia, the new federalism he created for his country. Despite legitimate complaints about his attitude to the freedom of the press, he was responsible for the first multi-party elections in 2000, 2005 and 2010. And we have just heard how he created double-digit growth for a decade, something unique in the history of Ethiopia. But for Prime Minister Meles, growth had always to have a purpose. In the numbers he got into schools, the numbers of children who survived childbirth, the number of mothers who escaped from maternal mortality, than in the growth rates that he achieved. And I remember my last conversation with him. We spent 2 hours when he was talking more about the need of 2 million and more children to get their first chance of education in the rural areas of Ethiopia and what we could do about it, using modern technology, using cash transfers to these families, getting teachers and getting schools into these areas, than he was talking about the industrial growth that he had achieved in his country. So for him, prosperity had always to have a purpose. I think we have to remember the history of Ethiopia. In the 1980s, the famine that killed 1 million people, the famine that produced Live Aid and its impact throughout the whole world, the famine that had Ethiopia at rock bottom for literacy and poverty and for so many other social ills. But it was also the country where, as he told me himself, mothers and fathers would not name their children for weeks and for months because of the fears that they would die in the first few days of their lives. Before Meles, that was the condition of Ethiopia. Because of Meles, infant mortality that carried off 1 in 5 of children before the age of 5 was cut by 60%. Births registered, clinics set up, medical centres in a whole range of areas, something that Bill Gates has just reported this year in his report, characterises the modern and the future life of Ethiopia. Before Meles, 6 out of 6 girls for every 10 boys at school. Because of Meles, girls getting to school, 9 girls out of 10. Before Meles, an economy that was in difficulty. Under Meles, the transformation that the ambassador has just talked about, the growth and transformation plan. And I remember introducing Prime Minister Meles to President Lee of South Korea. They met 9 times after that because it was important to Prime Minister Meles that he learned from the South Korean miracle, and he wanted to achieve with manufacturing, with the growth of textiles, with the growth of the apparels industry, with the growth of the flowers industry, other industries, the same kind of economic miracle that had been achieved in Korea. Prime Minister Meles brought the world to Africa, but at the same time, he told Africa about the need to engage itself in the world. He represented Africa at the G20, was the chairman of the Climate Change Task Force with me a few years ago. At the same time, he was president at one stage of the African Union, chairman of the Africa-Chinese Commission. At every point, chairman of NEPAD, the African Partnership for Growth. He was pushing the case of Africa to the world, and he was telling the world about the needs of Africa. There will be many memorials to Prime Minister Meles, and we've just heard today about the important foundation that has been created. There will be statues, there will be streets named after him, there will be institutes, there will be scholarships, but the memorial that he would welcome most, in my view, is that millions of people who will never have met him, millions of people who will never know his name perhaps, millions of people in Ethiopia have opportunities, have options, have choices, and have chances that they never could have had without him. That is the memorial that he and his family would value. All of us who remember Prime Minister Meles remember him as soft-spoken. I used to speak to him on his mobile phone, and I remember still that soft-spoken voice. They'll remember also that warm, winning smile. They'll remember too Prime Minister Meles as a family man, the pride he took as I talked to him about his children and their opportunities for the future. But they will remember him also as a man of great passion for justice, a man who was determined that every citizen in his country had the best chances possible. As we remember Prime Minister Meles, let us rededicate ourselves to the cause of securing justice for millions of people denied it, opportunity for millions who are still excluded, opportunity to escape poverty for millions of people in the Africa that he loved. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, for those fantastic remarks and some of your work incredibly closely, I know, with Prime Minister Meles, and who in turn had great respect, I know, for you and for everything you did for Africa. No one has yet mentioned the telecommunications industry and what the growth of that in Ethiopia, which is a gentle way of asking you and reminding you, please can you check that your mobile phones are switched off, because I heard 1 or 2 going off during those remarks. Please just check that your mobiles are switched off. It's now my great pleasure to welcome to the stage a former Minister for Africa, Boateng.
Your Excellency, Ambassador Kabede, colleagues, friends, it's really a huge and genuine honour to be asked to speak about the late Prime Minister of Ethiopia, Meles Zenawi. He was genuinely one of the most remarkable leaders it's been my good fortune to get to know. Aside from our political contact, Meles and I became good friends, and so in the next few minutes I also want to talk about friendship and the sense of loss that I feel and that I know so many of you will feel. I've already used the word remarkable, and others will speak today. The Ambassador already has, Gordon, in a very powerful and passionate and accurate and moving way, will speak of his leadership of the movement to get the rich nations of the world to understand properly the scourge of poverty and hunger and disease. And Meles did not, of course, just help us understand these matters. He was profoundly a man of action, and he acted on these dreadful enemies, as Gordon has just said, with purpose, enemies of human life and dignity. He was, when he died, rightly identified by other heads of African governments as their champion, and he was equally acknowledged in the prosperous world as a key international leader of the developing world, and also as a teacher. In trying to recognise today what he achieved, I want to comment on a few things. The first is that he was among the most fiercely independent thinkers I ever had the honour to know. He was a great thinker and he was a great man of action. And he clearly understood, where others had not as clearly understood, the need for durable development, for robust infrastructure, for replacing aid over time with Ethiopian economic dynamism as the route to eradicate poverty. While aid, of course, has its place in the face of crisis, it is not, and it was never for Prime Minister Meles more than a way of ameliorating a crisis. It was no substitute for building a real economy in which people had work, had things that they could do for others that were of economic value. And I know from discussion, he described how if you could generate, for example, enough power, you could enhance the value of the basic commodities produced so successfully in Ethiopia. You could develop infrastructure, you could avoid the peaks and troughs of global raw commodity markets. You could make things that others wanted to buy, provide services that others wanted. You could bring basic domestic advances to people whose lives were otherwise shackled by drudgery. And there were many examples of it, many examples worked out with universities and businesses in this country. And I must say, as those developments happened, I was not at all surprised to find that Meles was a fine strategist for Ethiopia and Africa more widely. Before I ever met him, I knew parts of his extraordinary story. My friends at the Open University told me with some wonder of a young African liberation leader, a significant military commander, who'd studied for their prestigious Masters of Business Administration degree whilst fighting in the bush. The staff of the Open University candidly could not understand how this might be possible. It was remarkable enough in itself that the student in question, Meles Zenawi, after many years of study, then achieved in 1995 the highest ever recorded mark awarded in the history of that degree, and I believe it's a record he still holds. I first had the honour of meeting him when I welcomed African leaders to the Gleneagles Make Poverty History G8 conference. We spent rather more time together than had ever been planned because our Prime Minister then, Tony Blair, had to return to London suddenly to deal with the 2005 bombings on the transport system in London. It was a sombre moment. But I'll always remember with great gratitude Prime Minister Meles' words of condolence and solidarity in the face of terror and his understanding of what it is. We travelled back to London on the plane together, and by the time we landed I knew that we would be firm and honest and candid friends We did not always agree, but we often did. And in discussions in Addis and Sirte, in the Gambia, in Brussels, in New York and in London, on each occasion you could only be impressed by his forensic intellect and his ability to act effectively. Discussions ranged over the stability of the African Union, its leadership, the opportunities that might exist and were being missed for resolution in Darfur, the advancement of women in his own country, the opportunities demanded by young Africans for an economic life, the importance of access to the sea for the Ethiopian trade and economy, and many other difficult issues. I just give a couple of quick examples. His analysis of the clans and sub-clans around Mogadishu was the most accurate and compelling I ever heard. His understanding of what could be achieved and the timing that might be required were far ahead of the thinking anywhere else. He was forensic and he was practical. When we discussed tensions on the Eritrean border around the town of Badme, his assessment of forces and capabilities deployed on both sides, of the diminishing security of the UN mission, were better insights than I had heard anywhere else. It became possible after discussion with him to work out, and he worked it out of course, how he could move his forces back to lessen tension, and the international community could always have confidence in the decisions that he took. It was always easiest to work with him when we asked our advisors to leave us. That was the time you could have an informal chat. We talked openly and honestly. We were serious, of course, but I must tell you we laughed a lot as well about life in general. We'd follow that up in the same spirit on the phone as friends do. And we never ever failed to talk about our great shared passion for football and the latest clashes in the Premier League. I don't mean this frivolously. He was a real man, a real person. The Prime Minister was, I don't share this with him, a passionate Manchester United fan. In the Gambia, there appear to be one or two others. well done, guys. In the Gambia, I was able to give him a number 10 United shirt with his own name on it and signed by the players in the team. And I have to admit that on occasions we discussed difficult issues whilst actually watching a match together. We learned to discuss without becoming too distracted by the football. As I think of the depth of his knowledge and the range of his analysis, of his straightforward expression of complex issues, and how much I learned from him, I suspect the only area where I knew more than Meles was about the role of holding midfield players. And I'm not even confident of that. My friends, I remember him with affection and admiration, one of the cleverest men I have ever known, yet one of the most modest. His political attributes are well known, and I emphasise today his qualities as a friend. Of course, he was a mixture, like all of us, of all human qualities, and he would have been the first to say so. My life was richer for knowing him.
Gentlemen, after that we have our first musical interlude by Dan Kieran.
Minna, ክብሩን በተግባር የሚያሳይ ተተኪና ለባወቀ ሞት እንዲህ ባልተጨነቀ ለኢትዮጵያ ሰፊ ራዕይ ክብሩን በተግባር የሚያሳይ ተተኪና ለባወቀ ሞት እንዲህ ባልተጨነቀ ለኢትዮጵያችን ነፃነት ማማት የከፈለ የድህነትን ዘር ትውልድ ነበልባል ያቀጣጠለ ለታገለለት ዓላማ እንዲከፍሉ እየታየ የሞተው በአካል እንጂ መንፈሱ ከኛ ተለየ የሞተው በአካል እንጂ መንፈሱ ከኛ ተለየ ምነው ክፉ ተመኘ ምነው ዛሬ ተመኘ ተተኪ ጋር ባወቀ ሞት እንዲህ ባልተጨነቀ ተተኪ ጋር ባወቀ ሞት እንዲህ ባልተጨነቀ ከሬት የመረረ ሐዘን ቢሆንብን ፈተና ትምህርትና አንዲት ፍሬ መሰዋት ይገኛልና ለኢትዮጵያ ሰፊ ራዕይ ለማስረፍ የምንሰራ እልፎችን ዛሬ ፈጥረናል ተረካቢ ባለአደራ እልፎችን ዛሬ ፈጥረናል ተረካቢ ባለአደራ ምነው ክፉ ተመኘ ምነው ዛሬ ተመኘ ተተኪ እንዳለ ባወቀ ሞት እንዲህ ባልተጨነቀ ተተኪ እንዳለ ባወቀ ሞት እንዲህ ባልተጨነቀ
While former Prime Minister Gordon Brown leaves, I'm delighted to hand the floor to the Right Honourable Paul Boateng.
Your Excellency, parliamentary colleagues, past and present, brothers and sisters, friends and admirers of Ethiopia and the late Prime Minister Meles. There was a great Pan-African educationalist and advocate for the economic and intellectual, as well as the political emancipation of the continent of Africa, who, speaking many years ago in the early part of the 20th century, speaking all over the world, but also, as it happens, in Addis, of the challenges of development, used to say, only the best is good enough for Africa. Only the best is good enough for Africa. And in Prime Minister Meles Zenawi, we had an example of the best, of the very best of African leadership. Someone who rightly joins the pantheon of leaders who you can see celebrated around the main atrium of the new AU buildings in Addis, for those of you who have been there, who joins the pantheon of great African leaders. Kwame Nkrumah, Julius Nyerere, Nasa Owar Tambo, Dr. Azikwe, all those great Africans of the past. Prime Minister Meles Zenawi was a great African leader of his time. A great African leader who kept alive at a difficult moment in history the flame of Pan-Africanism, who strove always for excellence, for the best, who recognized the critical link between political and economic emancipation. You can't have one without the other. Prime Minister Meles must be regarded as one of the founding fathers of the modern African Union. And it's right that that institution that fell into the doldrums is now beginning to assert itself in the way that it is. And Prime Minister Meles always recognized the importance of making sure that Africa's voice was heard. He gave voice to Africa at critical moments in our global history. He was a formidable man in every sense of that word. And when I look around this room, I see many people, and not just those who are speaking, who had cause to experience just how formidable he could be. Formidable in the public arena, formidable in private encounter. If you went to see Prime Minister Meles, you had to have your wits and your arguments about you. And if for one moment you left either at the door, you would know it. You would know it. He loved an argument. He loved that intellectual debate, that challenge. And he always gave as good as he got. And he tended to have the last word. He never accepted the perceived wisdom that gained ground in the 1980s, largely pushed by the World Bank, that provided Africa concentrated on primary education, then all would be well. You remember that wisdom that was around in the 80s and still lurks a bit. And I remember once going to see Prime Minister Meles. I had a brief in my hand. I think some assiduous ambassador had given it to me beforehand. He may even be in this room, I don't know. But I had this brief, And it was a time in which, and you'll remember this, and some of you younger ones are the beneficiaries of it, when the Prime Minister was really building the higher educational component of Ethiopia's education system. And there was some concern that this was at the expense of primary education. So the brief urged caution in that respect. So when I came into the room, we had the usual pleasantries, we were just together, and he said, "I suppose you've come to talk to me about education." So I said, funny you should mention that, Prime Minister. There was a brief to that effect. He said, "Don't bother. Let me tell you this. Primary education is all very well, but who is going to prepare the teachers? Primary education is all very well, but unless I have a strong economy, I can't sustain the schools or the teachers, or provide jobs for the pupils when they leave. Unless I have a higher education system that delivers me a cadre of people who are capable of delivering in both the private and the public sector, unless I have a higher education system that gives Ethiopia the capacity to grow and develop science, technology, and innovation, nothing else will matter. And I will not have done for my country what my country demands of me and what they are entitled to expect." Now, at that time, that was not the perceived wisdom. We all know the truth of what Prime Minister Meles was saying then. And we all know how it is benefiting not just Ethiopia, but the wider African continent and the wider world now. On agriculture, there was a time, and again, when I'm afraid the World Bank didn't think that agriculture was very important. And Prime Minister Meles always said, one of the last things actually he said to me about agriculture was that we should never forget that in Africa, 60% of the world's remaining arable land, cultivable land, is on the continent of Africa. And he said, "Paul, my country knows and understands about food security. My country knows and understands about the impact of the absence of nutrition and access to nutrition in Ethiopia. And his own attitude towards faith, I would describe as one of critical appreciation and respect. And I saw him just last year, and I was in Addis in order to speak, because I'm a Methodist lay preacher, at a prayer breakfast for the African Union. And of course, I went to pay my respects and said, "Paul, what are you doing here?" And I said, "Well, actually, as you asked, I didn't particularly want to engage in a religious debate with him. You know, it's not always wise." So I said, "Well, as you asked, I want to talk about something else entirely." I said, "Well, as you asked, Prime Minister, I'm here to deliver a homily at the prayer breakfast." And he said, "Well, prayer. Well," he said, "prayer may help. All else has failed." But you know, his great faith and confidence was in the innate goodness of his fellow men and women, and of the capacity of the human spirit to grow and to prosper, not just individually, but collectively. So it's right that in a place like this, on an occasion such as this, when we reflect on a life, that we should think of the Spirit and the life of the Spirit too.
Where once we walked with farmers, over hills remembered still for bleakness. Today we lose our way beneath the forest canopy and meet the elephants returned to greet us. You'll find us by the gleaming ponds in nearby fields, or lured like oxen and strange waterbirds to lakes behind the dams, new built by hands of village families. You'll glimpse us in the iridescent flash of starlings' wings, who watch with jeweled eyes the old bent priest plant his delicate wands, lemon and peach, on irrigated ground. We walk beside the children on their way to school, both boys and girls. Take baskets of injera to the feast and lead the dance at weddings where the bride is more than 16 years. Oh, why could you not wait for Mescarum, the women sing? I say to them that darkness pierced by countless lights, as if a sky of stars had fallen to the earth, also counts as harvest. Do not spend your zeal in mourning me. I am not dead. Seek out the great new dam, the waters roar. There you'll hear my voice. Remember what I said before. Although the struggle's long, the future's bright. It's no marathon. You shall not suffer hardship like those who fought and won. Hold fast the baton. Take your turn to run. Then pass it on. Thank you.
It's my great pleasure now to talk.
Thank you so much for asking me to speak on this special occasion. At the age of 21 in 1967, I travelled around Ethiopia for a few weeks by bus. The country was desperately poor. It was suffering from an incompetent imperial administration and the legacy of a colonialist invasion. Meles Zenawi was not yet into his teens. A brutally damaging military regime was to follow. When I returned to Ethiopia as chief economist of the World Bank, celebrated by Paul just now, over 30 years later, Meles was halfway through 2 decades of a leadership which saw transformation of economic and human development of extraordinary proportions. As well as brilliantly political and strategic, Meles was supremely analytical and quantitative. And he would have wanted and expected some numbers at his memorial, including, indeed, 1 or 2 counterfactuals. So for Meles, from a professor of economics at the LSE, here are just a few. Over the decades of his leadership, primary school enrollment for girls went from 32% to 100%, and for boys from 50% to 111%. That includes, of course, some older children who previously missed out. These were much bigger increases in sub-Saharan Africa. Over these 2 decades, under-5 mortality fell by 60% in Ethiopia, compared to sub-Saharan Africa's 40%, itself a considerable achievement. If the figures for the fall in Ethiopia had been the same as sub-Saharan Africa, there's your counterfactual, there would have been around 500,000 more deaths of under-5s per year in recent years, and around 5 million more such deaths over the 2 decades. Political and moral issues at stake, of which he was keenly aware. But his command of the crucial underlying economic theory of of such tenurial structures was also very deep. And this from someone who'd been a guerrilla leader for, at that point, around 2/3 of his adult life. And we should recognise that the land reforms he led provided equal property rights for women. I later had the privilege of working with him in 2004-05 when, with our Chair Miles and others, we were writing the report for the Commission for Africa, where he was a driving influence, both politically and intellectually. Then a few years later, in the run-up to the climate change conference in Copenhagen in 2009, where it was Meles who insisted on and obtained the promise of 100 billion per annum in flows from developed to developing countries. Let's see if they make good on that promise. We continued that collaboration on the United Nations Advisory Group on Climate Financing in 2010, which he co-chaired and steered, often managing great political tension, whilst at the same time carefully scrutinising the analytical detail. Our last collaboration, one which I hold very dear, was on the BRICS-led Development Bank, which was in large measure his conception. That's not widely known or understood, but in large measure his conception, and which he knew before he died was likely to go forward. The decision to do so was taken last month. It's been very moving over the last few days to look back over our private emails. We corresponded at the rate of one every week or so for most of the past 4 years. They were invariably precise and considered, often very funny, including in his reference to, quotes, the usual suspects. There is no prize for guessing who they were, and they were always unsigned, perhaps a relic of all those years as a guerrilla leader. And when I told him of our family news, particularly the birth of grandchildren, his first sentences of the next email were fond and family-based. He was someone to whom family was of fundamental importance. It was a friendship which I shall always cherish. He was a tough man in a tough place, ready to take difficult decisions. He was a man of extraordinary political acumen, a man of outstanding intelligence. I confess it is very rare for an academic to say what I'm about to say, but he was one of the most intelligent men I've ever met. His commitment to fighting poverty in Ethiopia, Africa, and the world was fundamental to his being. For him, it was about morality, dignity, and common humanity. It was what drove him forward. It was the unrelenting focus of his prodigious talents. And here, his achievements on the issues that mattered so much to him were colossal. He saw the possibility of so much more. He had a vision, which we often discussed, of Ethiopia as a middle-income and carbon-neutral country. He saw how to get there. He was at the forefront of building Africa as a continent of opportunity. He was already demonstrating Africa's role in world leadership. He did so much to realise those visions. The world has lost an extraordinary and irreplaceable leader, and we have lost a precious friend. The ideas, the vision, the commitment of this remarkable man must and will stay with us. Thank you.
And one final speaker before our next musical interlude, the Right Hon. Clare Short, with whom I worked very closely when she came into the new Department for International Development, sweeping much before her and believing very strongly in partnerships with governments and with strong leaders like Prime Minister Meles. Clare.
Thank you, Miles. Excellencies, friends, I'm honoured to have this chance to pay my tribute to Prime Minister Meles Zenawi, a great Ethiopian, a great African leader, a personal friend, and hearing from all these friends, I think he had a gift of friendship, but he had a gift of making friendships with people who might be able to help Ethiopia develop in the way that he wanted it to. And I'm glad Gordon has gone, because I want to say this, and others have said it, the most intelligent politician I've ever met in my life. We first met, Prime Minister Meles and I, through correspondence. After we formed our government in 1997, we were attempting, with the help of some very impressive Algerian diplomats, to prevent the Ethiopian-Eritrean war over Badme. And as you know, we failed. He said then that the government had survived because the rural areas remained loyal, but he had, after the elections, had some very frank meetings with village people who told him what had been wrong and why some people weren't happy. And he said there were important lessons that had to be learned. As you know, it's widely thought that after those elections there was less openness for free public debate and civil society. Prime Minister Meles always said he wanted to build a liberal state, but now that task is left for another generation of Ethiopians. My most recent visit to Ethiopia was a few months ago, after Prime Minister Meles' untimely death. While there, I met with impressive ministers and officials dedicated to continuing his development work. That's the development state that he built. It's still functioning and lots of very capable, very committed people. I visited impressive house building and waste disposal projects in Addis. I also witnessed the impressive progress in economic development, in poverty reduction. The figures have been given to us by Nick. Reduction of the incidence of malaria, and growth in immunisation, and big improvements in child survival, and the big increase in children in primary school. The figures have already been given. There's also been a very impressive effort to prevent corruption and build competent state institutions, and a very important commitment to build a zero-carbon economy. These achievements have been made with a much lower incidence of inequality than elsewhere, and a much stronger commitment to job generation and urban growth. So for Ethiopia, he was a gift, but as a model for others, he was a gift. Because as you all know, with development that comes partly out of the commodity boom, you get growing inequality everywhere. We've had it across the world, and it's happening across Africa. And Meles had the wisdom to hold down that growth of inequality in Ethiopia, which means the poor then get benefit from economic growth, whereas in a very unequal country, they get very little benefit. This is an enormously important thing for Ethiopia and indeed as a model for other countries. I also, of course, saw the many pictures of Prime Minister Meles mourning his death all over Addis, and spoke with many Ethiopians who told me of their great love and respect for him, ordinary Ethiopians, not people in official position. My conclusion was, and is, as I've said, that the untimely death of Meles Zenawi is a great tragedy for his family and for Ethiopia, but he has left a lasting legacy in the enormous progress in building his development state in Ethiopia, an achievement that will go on reverberating and promoting development for the people of Ethiopia and Africa more broadly, long into the future. Thank you, Meles Zenawi, for your leadership, your great achievements, and your friendship. We will miss you badly, but your work goes on.
Boateng
Thank you very much for that extraordinarily colourful, moving performance. Thank you. It's my great pleasure now to introduce Lawrence Robertson, who's the chair of the all-party group on Ethiopia and a very long-time friend of that country.
It's my honour to be asked to say a few words in memory of Meles, the respected leader who passed away unexpectedly last year. Of course, this year, just a few days ago, we in the United Kingdom lost a former leader, former Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. Both Prime Ministers led their respective countries out of troubled times and offered them brighter futures. Of course, the difficulties Ethiopia faced over 20 years ago were more profound than those we in the United Kingdom faced. Nevertheless, both countries were looking for leaders at that time. Both were fortunate in finding them, in Ethiopia's case, with Meles. Just as I met Margaret many times, I was also privileged to meet Meles on a number of occasions, both in this country and in Ethiopia. Whenever I went on delegations or led delegations to Ethiopia, Meles was always very generous with his time. He was also very brave and forthright in answering points we put to him. Not necessarily questions he might have wanted to receive, but questions we felt were necessary, and questions which he always fully addressed. Of course, our two countries have long histories. Ethiopia is one of the world's oldest civilizations, with many historians pointing out that it was one of the first countries to embrace Christianity. It's also a country in which people with different faiths live together in peace. Similarly, the United Kingdom also houses people of different religions, and we have an established Christian church at the heart of our constitution. So there are a number of things which bind us historically, but we also have very close links now. Of course, personal relationships are as important in politics as elsewhere. And I've spoken privately to our Prime Minister, David Cameron, about Ethiopia. And indeed, just a few weeks before the untimely death of Meles, Mr. Cameron told me that he admired him very much and found him to be a very valuable leader in Africa. The relationship was clearly a good one, and I know that that was very helpful when formulating certain policies such as the International Development Agenda. Of course, these days, international development is rightly a high-profile issue, thanks to people like Clare and many other statesmen. But Meles also played a very leading role in that, and it is one of the most important issues now. The Millennium Goals are taken very seriously. The subject is often on the G8 agenda. The leadership of Meles was very important in this respect. As chairman of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Ethiopia, I was particularly pleased and very proud that under the leadership of Meles and our present Prime Minister, David Cameron, Ethiopia became the largest recipient of our international development budget, again demonstrating the ties between our two countries.
I first met Meles in the early 90s. He was an astonishing individual who I think will be judged as one of the great men of Africa. He came out of a revolution. He turned Ethiopia into the start of being an economic powerhouse in the marketplace. He had extraordinary personal magnetism. The reason why other countries outside Ethiopia looked to him and to Ethiopia was because of his personal qualities as well as his high intelligence and clear commitment to developing Ethiopia in the right way. Of course, there remain questions about democracy, questions about human rights, and that I would have liked to have seen go further and faster. But you have to remember that Ethiopia was a torn country, and it is still in a very delicate and complex part of the world. I remember very early on saying, well, what would count as success for you? And he said, when I can step down after being elected leader from office. And when I saw him on several occasions, I'd always say, well, hang on, it hasn't arrived yet. And it's a great tragedy that it didn't arrive, because he died at a time when Ethiopia could ill afford to lose him, and indeed Africa could ill afford to lose him. But that he wanted to step down, that he wanted Ethiopia, and I still hope Ethiopia will become a great democratic, open state, I have no doubt.
Excellencies, friends, it's really all been said this morning. Of course, in a way, we've only hinted at in our tributes today at what came out much more clearly and sometimes less politely in the obituaries, this astonishing paradox of this remarkable leader, the development president who, in the eyes of his critics, very much put democracy and human rights second. But you know, that grow up with a particular European consciousness. Because as Clare so powerfully argued, for those of us who knew Ethiopia before Meles, and I knew it as a young refugee official and journalist in the 80s, his was a life of extraordinary struggle, both as a guerrilla leader, but ultimately a struggle for Ethiopia itself. Yes, it began as a young medical student who departed his studies to go to the hills of Tigray and Eritrea as a fighter. But when he came to power, as those of us who'd seen Ethiopia before him recall so clearly, he had to take command of a state which was always surprisingly efficient. The real paradox in Ethiopia before Meles was of an efficient state presiding over the poorest country in Africa, a state that quite simply did not serve the people, but served the elites of first the emperor and then Mengistu, a state that did not deal with the fundamental underlying issues of food security, which did not bring the isolated villages and communities of the country into contact or connection with the capitals and other cities of Ethiopia. A state which tolerated astonishing levels of human underdevelopment. Nick gave us the statistics of the level of child mortality, the astonishing levels of illiteracy. Not a choice between development and democracy. It was the challenge of empowering and liberating the people of his country. And those of us who were lucky enough and privileged enough to talk to him through those years, and just perhaps if you just add together the hours that those of us who've spoken today clearly spent with him, it's remarkable that he also ran a country. And of course, he managed it because he worked an astonishing daily work day and did it 7 days a week, 365 days a year by all accounts. And of course, that journey which brought Ethiopia from the extreme levels of poverty to one where not just incomes had risen in the way we heard, but the opportunities of secondary and higher education, of decent health care, had reached the furthest corners of the country. And yes, given the fact that he was bending the will of a country which still had groups that did not accept the great, if you like, liberating socialist agenda that he brought to power. Yes, he did it with an iron hand. This was a tough man in a tough neighborhood, as we heard before. But I have no doubt that in two remarkable ways, he was quite unlike the leaders that he's sometimes compared to. Because as we just heard, this was a man who relished retirement and the prospect of pursuing an academic life. He did not enjoy the trappings or rituals of power. He was impatient to return to the studies at which he was so good. But this was also a man who did not deny a fuller panoply of political and human rights for his country. This was a man, after all, who brought universal democratic elections to Ethiopia. But it was nevertheless someone for whom he recognized that the political revolution must come on the heels of the development revolution. To this day, to his last days, he saw how the economic and social changes he's made were bumping up that need for a greater political emancipation. The anomaly of a very controlled information technology system, as in Ethiopia's neighbors, IT was taking off in a country such as Kenya. The anomalies of still an unliberalized banking sector were making it realize that not just for the grounds of political inclusion, but to maintain the extraordinary development success he'd achieved, that political liberalization must come. And I think for him, a second tragedy of departing the stage when he did was not just that it didn't allow him the chance to go back to his library and his studies, but that he didn't see the completion of a revolution that he anticipated too, when Ethiopia's new economic and social rights would be accompanied by as full an expression of its political rights. He was taken from us before his and Ethiopia's revolution was complete. But I think he would be watching somewhere with a benign and happy eye as it marches on towards that final destination of a country where the revolution is not complete in terms of economic and social statistics alone, but in terms of full freedoms for its citizens. He's been a great foot soldier, a great African. You've heard it from many today. We all, I think, end this service realizing that what we sometimes thought were our own hidden feelings about this remarkable man are shared across many here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. It remains only for me to thank once again our speakers. I think it's been a remarkable tribute to a remarkable man. To thank you all for coming and joining in what I feel to have been a just reflection of a remarkable life, a leader in a remarkable country, one that I know, I speak for all of us who've spoken today, one that we all love and love to go back to. So thank you all again for coming. I think the last thing we need to do, if you wouldn't mind, is please stand for the Ethiopian national anthem.